Good morning, one and all. So, in this presentation, we are going to discuss or we are going to have a broad overview of carbohydrate metabolism. So, if you see our food habits, so majority of the foodstuffs that we take, starting from breakfast, lunch, dinner, so that will have a greater proportion of carbohydrates in it. Okay, so this carbohydrates it forms the major source of energy for the body. It is the carbohydrate which the body depends first for the production of energy, then comes the lipid. Okay, so today we will have just an overview about what happens to the carbohydrate that we take in and how it is metabolized and how much of energy is released from this carbohydrate. So the carbohydrate that we take in, it is majorly in the form of starch. So starch is one of the polysaccharide which is made of n number of glucose units. So whatever foodstuff we take, they are all rich in the polysaccharide starch. So when we see the broad wings of this metabolism, so there are two wings of metabolism. One is called as anabolism or synthesis process. So when we take lot of glucose molecule, so the excess glucose molecule, it gets converted into glycogen, which is the storage form of glucose, and it gets stored in liver and skeletal muscles. So the synthesis of macromolecule from simpler molecules like glucose is a monosaccharide, glycogen is a polysaccharide. So from these monosaccharide, a polysaccharide is built. So that is called as anabolism. So the other wing is called as catabolism or breakdown process. So here the reversal happens. So here the polysaccharide glycogen is broken down into simpler unit, the monosaccharide glucose. So whenever there is a very low glucose level or whenever you are starving, so whatever glycogen is stored in skeletal muscle and liver, they are again converted back to glucose. So if you see the catabolism process, so I told you the major fuel are carbohydrate and lipid. So both will undergo a process called as oxidation. So it is oxidation of fuel which will lead to production of energy. So when I say oxidation, so if we are talking about carbohydrate, whatever carbohydrate that we are taking, that has to be first, that will undergo breakdown process to yield the monosaccharide unit. So the monosaccharide unit which carbohydrates yield are glucose. So now during the catabolic process, this glucose has to get oxidized to produce carbon dioxide and water. So that's what we will see in this presentation just as an overview. We are not going into the intricate details of the metabolic pathways. So let us start with the digestion of carbohydrate. So the digestion of carbohydrate directly starts from the mouth. So in mouth we have an enzyme called as ptyalin. Okay. So this ptyalin is otherwise known as alpha amylase. So majority of the species they have this ptyalin, but this ptyalin or alpha amylase is lacking in certain carnivorous species like dogs and cats. So dogs and cat they don't have alpha amylase, salivary amylase. So the digestion does not start from the mouth. Otherwise the other herbivores, cattle, sheep, goat, they all possess human, we all possess this salivary amylase. So as I told, the carbohydrate which we take in is in the form of starch. So first thing what happens is the salivary amylase will act upon the starch, which is nothing but glucose, made of glucose units. So that will be broken down into small fragments. So these are called as dextrin. So that takes place in the mouth. Then stomach, there would be some amount of acid hydrolysis that takes place in the stomach. That will again lead to production of some amount of dextrin. Okay. So then the dextrin will move on to the intestine. So in intestine, especially small intestine, there is another amylase which is produced called as pancreatic amylase. So this pancreatic amylase pours into the small intestine. So this will again break down the dextrin and they will lead to production of small disaccharide units called as maltose. So maltose is a disaccharide made up of two glucose subunits. Okay. So this maltose will be acted upon by certain enzymes called as maltase. So these are certain enzymes which can be produced by the intestinal flora. So maltase will act on maltose to liberate the two glucose units that have been bonded together. Same way we have other enzymes like sucrase and lactase. So sucrase will act on sucrose, which is nothing but the common table sugar that we take in, and lactase will act on lactose, which is the milk sugar. So finally, at the end of digestion, what is expected is whatever polysaccharide that we take, that will be broken down to release the monosaccharide, and the monosaccharide which is released is majorly glucose. So at the end of digestion, more glucose is produced. It is this glucose which is absorbed into the bloodstream, and via bloodstream it is going to travel to the different cells of the body. And inside the cell, this glucose will undergo oxidation, and it will be converted into water and carbon dioxide, which will lead to production of energy in the form of ATP. So let us have an overview of what happens to this glucose inside the cell. So I told you complete oxidation of glucose. So that involves two metabolic pathways. One is called as glycolysis and the other is called as TCA cycle or Krebs cycle. So this glycolysis, it takes place in the cytoplasm. So here what happens is glucose, which is a 6 carbon unit, will get broken down into two 3 carbon units called as pyruvate. So this takes place in the presence of oxygen and an aerobic condition, and it consists of 10 steps. Okay, in 10 steps, 6 carbon glucose is getting converted to 3 carbon pyruvate. So we get 2 molecules of pyruvate. Next, what happens to this pyruvate is it is getting converted into acetyl-CoA molecule. So this is again a 3 carbon molecule. So this conversion takes place inside the mitochondria. So during this process of breakdown and conversion to other molecule, there are certain reducing equivalents and some amount of ATP which is produced. So if you see this 10 steps of glycolysis, it will yield 4 molecules of ATP, but 2 molecules will be used by the glycolysis itself in its first step. So instead of 4, the net gain would be 2 ATPs. And we also see something here called as NADH. So what is this NADHs? They are certain reducing equivalents. So as I told, glucose will undergo oxidation. So what is oxidation? Oxidation is either removal of electrons or addition of oxygen. So whenever there are electrons which are removed from this molecules, so it is this reducing equivalents like NADH. There is one more called as FADH2. So they are the one which are going to accept the electrons or take up the electrons which are released out during the catabolism. Okay. So what these NADH2 and FADH2 do is they enter into another pathway called as electron transport chain. So this electron transport chain, it operates in the inner mitochondrial membrane. There will be some carriers again for electron in the membrane of the inner mitochondrial membrane. Okay. So what this NADH2 and FADH2 do is they will go to the inner mitochondrial membrane to this electron transport chain, and they will transfer their electrons there. Whatever electrons they have gained from these pathways, metabolic pathways, would be transferred into the electron transport chain. So when one NADH transfers its electron to the electron transport chain, it results in production of 2.5 ATPs, and one FADH2 will yield 1.5 ATPs. Okay, so here we have got 2 NADH from glycolysis and 2 NADH by conversion of pyruvate to acetyl-CoA. So 2 into 2.5 is 5 and 2 into 2.5 is 5. So totally we get 5 ATPs here and 5 ATPs here plus the 2 ATP which have been released as such during glycolysis. So glycolysis will yield the net gain of ATP from glycolysis is 7, and by conversion of pyruvate to acetyl-CoA we again get 5 ATPs. So totally at the end of glycolysis and when pyruvate is converted to acetyl-CoA, we get 12 ATPs from this particular pathway. So now we will see the second metabolic pathway. So wherein acetyl-CoA is getting converted to carbon dioxide and water. So this takes place in a pathway called as TCA cycle or tricarboxylic acid cycle, or it is otherwise called as Krebs cycle. So it is both glycolysis and TCA put together leads to complete oxidation of glucose. So glucose was the starting material in glycolysis, and you see the end product of this TCA cycle is carbon dioxide and water. So when TCA cycle gets completed, only then glucose is getting completely oxidized into carbon dioxide and water. So again, this is a 10-step process. So this operates in the mitochondria. So during this conversion of acetyl-CoA, oxidation of acetyl-CoA to carbon dioxide and water, we again get one ATP, 3 NADH and one FADH2 molecule. So this NADH and FADH2, again they will go to the electron transport chain and transfer their electrons to the components there. So that will result in production of ATPs. So 3 NADH2, 3 into 2.5 is 7.5. 1 FADH2, 1 FADH2 will yield 1.5 ATPs. So 7.5 plus 1.5 is 9, plus as such there is 1 ATP, the form of GTP, which is produced from TCA cycle. So totally one acetyl-CoA molecule will yield 10 ATPs. Okay, but we have how many acetyl-CoA? From 2 pyruvate we got 2 acetyl-CoA molecules. So total gain of ATP in TCA cycle is 20. Okay, so we get 20 ATPs from TCA cycle and 12 ATPs from glycolysis and conversion of pyruvate to acetyl-CoA. So totally, if we see the energy that we yield from complete oxidation of one molecule of glucose under aerobic condition, that is in presence of oxygen, the net gain of ATP is 32. So by complete oxidation of one molecule of glucose, 32 ATPs are generated. So this here with this we end this presentation. So this was just to give an overview of how many ATPs are produced from one molecule of glucose, what are the how it and carbohydrates undergo digestion, and what are the pathways which leads to oxidation of glucose, and the energy metabolics of this glucose molecule. Thank you for patient listening. Thank you very much.